Hello YouTube, welcome back. This is the first episode of a new series where we recreate the Sutton Hoo iron stand. So it's quite an elaborate piece, it has a basket on top, and the body of the stand itself is tapering from 20x16 all the way down to 10mm square. And right at the bottom there is a spike for sticking it into the ground, which has a couple of nice scrolls. So in this first episode we are going to be forging the body of the stand, which as I said is this tapering piece of iron. I'm actually using mild steel for this, which is 20mm square, purely because I don't have enough wrought iron left anymore after all the wrought iron projects I've been doing. So this taper is quite a long taper, it's going to be 165cm long, so I'm going to be doing the bulk of this underneath the power hammer. And it did take me pretty much most of the day to get this done accurately. So to start with, we're going to take the very tip of it, which is the top end, down to 10mm square. And in fact the very tip is going to be a little bit less than 10mm square. I'm going to take it down to probably around 8mm, and what that will do is it will allow me to create a riveted connection right at the top when we get to that stage. So obviously for drawing a taper I am working the thin ends more than the thick ends. And every now and then I will just check my measurements to make sure it's not too thin or too thick. So using my calipers set to 10mm, I will find where the 10mm point is and measure back from that. And the reason I'm measuring is to check the thickness at a point a quarter of the way down the shaft and a point halfway down the shaft. Now, because of the degree of taper, I'm looking at a swelling of 2.5mm every quarter length. So I'm just using the calipers to make sure that I achieve that degree of taper. So as you can see in this instance, it is still thicker than it needs to be most of the way down. So at that stage I will just go back to the power hammer and pull out the material where it needs to be pulled out. So beyond the halfway point, you have enough taper that you can actually do this by eye and then double check the measurements when you get to a finishing point. So this is possibly the longest taper which I've ever drawn out, and you do have to be reasonably on the ball to achieve that 2.5mm swelling over a distance of, I think it was 385mm between quarters. So when your taper's drawn out, just give it a straighten. It's best to straighten these things as you go along with any project, whatever the shape of the part, purely because there's a good chance it'll be harder to do later. So with the taper done, I'm going to put these two little scrolls at the top. Now these are quite interesting. They're not evenly shaped or anything on the drawing. I have looked at the archaeological photographs and they're not evenly shaped on there either, so I believe the drawing is quite accurate. So the first twist starts 48mm down from the top, then the first twist itself is 96mm long, then there's a 58mm gap, and the second twist is 80mm long. So I'm out of chalk at the moment, so I'm marking all those up with pencil. And then I'll just lightly centre dot all those pencil marks. So use chalk if you can. It tends to survive better in the fire. So it's quite long, so my vise was struggling to hold it, so I simply put it in the vise at an angle. And the first twist is clockwise. And we want a twist and 3/4. And because this is a taper, you will find that it will twist faster at the top than at the bottom. So the trick to sort that out is to just cool off the area of fast twist after taking a second heat and just complete that twist thereafter. We'll just count the ridges in there, and I wanted 6 of them. So because I'm twisted with just a spanner, I will then use a hide mallet and a wooden block, and I'll just straighten that back out again. And I'm only giving it light blows because I don't want to damage these twists. And then it's time for the second twist. Now this one will go a turn and 3/4 counterclockwise. And here again you will see that I took a second heat in order to speed up the twist on that lower end, which is a bit fatter than the top end. And here we have the 2 twists. So, and all these distances and lengths are entirely based on the drawing. So then we will go to the bottom of the bar and start working on that. Now there is a spike at the bottom which is 110mm long. So I then measured 110mm from the bottom of the bar, marked that point, and measured 40mm down. And that 40mm piece of material will then be stretched to 110mm. Now if you're thinking that that's a bit short to draw out to 110mm, we do have these scrolls, so don't forget about that. So I then cut off the excess material, and this piece of bar which is left over I will then forge out to be 20x6 approximately. I did forge it a little bit thicker because the drawing shows the scrolls themselves are a little bit thicker than 6mm. However, I still used a piece of 20x6 as a kiss block for the power hammer to forge this out to the correct dimension. Now I could have used off-the-shelf stock, however it wouldn't have looked right, it wouldn't have looked hand-forged. So with this material drawn out to 20x6ish, I will then mark a point 60 centimeters from one end. And the reason I'm doing this is to figure out how much material I need for the scrolls, for the tapered scrolls. So I will then taper the end which I measured from, and I'm not going massively thin. I'm not doing a Renaissance style scroll, because the Anglo-Saxon scrolls tended to have quite a chunky taper. They didn't do all that feather edge stuff. Having forged out the taper for the scroll, I will then measure how long the bar now is, which was 622mm, which means that my taper spread out by 22mm. Now with the taper itself being 70mm long, I know that I need 48mm of material to draw that 70mm. And therefore I cut the bar accordingly and forge the second taper. And the length I am looking for is 590mm in order to form both scrolls, which this is spot on. So thanks to the beauty of mathematics. So I will then centre dot the centre of the bar, because we will need to fold this in a minute. And I will get some heat in those tapers again, and I will just start off those scrolls. Now we don't want to scroll everything at this stage, we just want to start the scroll because it will be difficult to do after we have welded the bar to the main shaft of the stand. So just flick it, and I'm only giving light hammer blows because we don't want to muller the work. So just start those off, which gives you something like this. So I will then head over to the vise, and this is the easiest way I could figure out of doing this. And I have marked point 10mm either side of the centre of the bar. And I will just bend that at that point. So it doesn't need to be perfect because we still need to do a final fitting to the shaft of the stand. But it does need to be reasonably close, or else it'll just flop about. So one side done, do the other side. This is why I quite like my narrow-jawed leg vise, because it's quite good for things like this. My other leg vise, the jaws are a bit thick for this kind of small-scale bending. So it could be quite fussy and do nice upset corners on this, but it's really not necessary because it's all going to be welded up anyway. So at that stage I will get a final heat in it. As you can see, it's a little bit loose, but all I'm doing is just banging the bar in there and closing up this scroll bar on it. So some of you might wince at the crudity of my technique on this, but it does work, and if it works, why the hell not? So this did leave me with a little bit of a gap at the bottom, but again I'm really not bothered about that because it's going to be welded up and forged all the way down to a point, so it doesn't really matter. So now we need to prepare for welding. Now the scroll bar is a lot thinner than the body of the shaft, so I will preheat the body of the shaft almost to a welding heat, and I will then bang that back into the scroll bar. Obviously, because metal expands when it's hot, it was a little bit tight. It will probably come loose again when I stick it in the fire and the scroll bar starts to heat up, but we can get around that. So the first thing I do is to just simply tack the ends together. That was quite a low welding heat, really doesn't matter. And then once it's tacked, you can then take a bigger heat and start welding it. Now I'm not using any flux for this because it's a mild steel to mild steel weld. You really don't need it, it's a complete waste of time. So don't fart about with all that rubbish, just weld it. And then just take a final welding heat and make sure it's all welded up properly. You want to be very careful not to overthin the transition between the welded area and the scroll bar. And with it all welded, just start forging out your taper. And as you can see, that gap that was there, that I don't think I actually pictured, but it was there, believe me, that has closed up completely. And for this kind of welding, you want to take the weld a little bit further up than you want it to be, just to make sure that it is exactly where you want it to be. And then just make sure you have a nice, smooth, clean point at the end. So with all that welded and tapered, I will give it a scrub and I will just ensure that the scroll bars are nice and straight and true. So I'm not wellying this, I'm just flattening it all together. And you can see I've got quite a nice transition, I haven't overthinned it or anything. And that's the beauty of welding further back than you need it to be. Because you know your weld is going to split right at the very top. And here is the welded item. So that's gone in quite nicely, as you can see. So at this stage I will just quench off the bottom of the weld, because I don't want to deform it. That is how you end up with cracking in your work where your welds are, if you wiggle it about too much, so the easiest solution is just to cool it off. So then start your scrolls. You can see I have a continuity error here, but that is because I forgot to film the start of the first scroll. So just basically tap it forwards, tap it down, and I'm not wellying it, I'm not being a savage here, I am just gently stroking it into position. I do really enjoy doing scrolls. So here you can see that magically we've gone back to the first scroll. And I'm just using all the edges of my anvil just to get a nice scroll on this. Now Anglo-Saxon scrolls tend to be quite evenly spaced, they didn't bother with any of that magical ratio and 7 parts and all that Renaissance stuff. So when it was quite close to being a decent Anglo-Saxon scroll, I just went in with some tongs and just squeezed it to get a nice even spacing between the different curves. Which I do find immensely satisfying. And then just make sure it sits nice and flat and straight. And here you have it. 2 nice Anglo-Saxon scrolls, which I think are quite accurate to the drawing as well. Which I'm quite happy about. And at this stage we've completed the main forging of the shaft for the stand. So here you see the point, the 2 scrolls, and that very elegantly tapering shaft all the way to the top. So thanks a lot for watching. Next episode we'll be starting on the bullhead bit at the top. So thanks very much to my donors on Patreon who very patiently support me and the videos that I produce. Without you guys helping me, I probably wouldn't be doing such big elaborate projects such as the Sutton Hoo iron treasures. So thanks a lot guys for allowing me to do this. A big shout out to Aaron Nelson as well, who is my golden Patreon donor. So thanks a lot Aaron, and thanks a lot everybody else. So there we are. So thanks a lot guys, and I will see you next week on the next episode. Bye.